inducing labor. That's breaking a woman's waters and making the uterus contract more strongly. Is it safe? It's an important question, and a large randomized trial has found the answer, at least for some women. The lead author was Bill Groban, who's professor of obstetrics and gynecology at Northwestern University in Chicago. I spoke to him earlier. What was being casted was their concept that, for many years, there has been a belief, really deeply ingrained, that labor induction leads to a greater chance of cesarean delivery. The truth is, though, that it's based on relatively long ago studies for which, and I'm happy to describe why, that has been a fundamental misinterpretation of the results, such that we misunderstood the clinical implications. Well, let's just talk about this misunderstanding, and just to be clear, when we're talking about labor induction, we're talking about breaking the waters and putting up a drip, which makes the uterus contract. When we're talking about labor induction, there's not a single way to do it. But that typically you're right. So was the problem in the past that, labor induction was done on women in distress. And therefore, it was a biased population. They were already in strife when they were induced. I think it's actually two issues. One of the issue that you already refer to, which is that so often women were being induced for a medical reason. Something else was going on, either that fetus was in need of being delivered, or the mother self had a complication that led to delivery being recommended, and clearly those were both situations that led to a higher chance of cesarean. But the other really important thing with that, the studies that were done, and when I face that I very much mean observational studies, not trials, but studies, where people went back and looked at records of women who had delivered, were women who were being induced were compared to women in spontaneous labor at the exact same, just occasionally age. And I think it is undeniable that if you make that comparison, that there's a greater chance of cesarean among women who were being induced than women in spontaneous labor at the exact same gestational age. Was that, well, I don't know why it necessarily is, but it just is. It's something that's observed. Something that when people studied it, not with the clinical trial, but with observational data that happened in very consistently. So, these are biased studies because they randomized. Let me put it this way. Induction of labor is an option. I can choose to be induced or not to be induced spontaneous. Labor is not the exact same day is not an option. Women may spontaneously have a labor but also may not. They may not go into labor for another 2 weeks. And, every week that goes by, the chance of cesarean increases. They may not go into labor and get to a point where induction of labor becomes recommended. But now it's an induction 1 or 2 or 3 weeks later, and so if you're making a clinical decision, and the clinical decision is, do I choose to be induced now or do I not? The alternative is not spontaneous labor on the same day. It's weird. The alternative is waiting, which may end up in spontaneous labor, but may not, or may end up in spontaneous labor weeks later. And when observational studies were constructed like that, studies that reflected the actual clinical situation, you see, very consistently did not see the association of induction with cesarean delivery. So now you've done a randomized trial where you actually get women, and you randomize them to induction or waiting. That's exactly right. So, and which is in women who've never had a baby before. That's right. And so that's, I think, an important point. Most of the concern with regard to cesarean delivery was with regard to women who had never had a baby before, women on their first birth. And I should also say that the end about women who have medical complications, for which there's local indication for induction. This was really a question of women who had no other reason, no standard reason to have induction recommended. Was it indeed true that induction would lead to an increased risk of cesarean? Or might it be, as the more recent observational study suggested, that induction didn't increase, or even decrease the chances of cesarean, and maybe also improve the outcome of their baby and sitting behind? This is a concern about high cesarean section rate complications and second pregnancies. You so kind of condemn yourself for committing yourself to a second cesarean, and sometimes the babies don't do as well. I think what we would say is that, for any woman who desires a vaginal birth that we want to do everything we can to try to optimize that chance. And clearly, if someone can have an uncomplicated vaginal birth person, uncomplicated to their own, both in terms of short-term complications, and long-term complications including complications for future pregnancies, it's preferable to have a vaginal birth. What we want to get rid of our unnecessary that area, delivery. So, there in deliveries, that would have potentially, preventable and the health of the mother and her child or children are preserved. Okay, so you to come over, 3,000 women, not a small study or sexually. Sorry 6,000 women 3,000 were assigned to labor. Induction at 39 weeks and 3,000 waited to see whether they went into spontaneous labor and they were low risk, as you said, and your outcome was mother's health, baby's health and cesarean sections. That right? Yeah? That's exactly right. It was 3,000 women in each group, low risk nulliparous, women on their first birth randomized, induction at 39 weeks, or expected management, or waiting, and not forever. Because there's still an upper limit at which, in the modern day, is considered sort of acceptable practice, but to about 42 weeks would be the upper limit. What did you find? All we found was that women who were randomized to labor, induction had a significantly lower chance of cesarean delivery. So about a 15% relative decrease in severe delivery. Women who were randomized to induction of labor-delivered babies, who are significantly less likely to need extra respiratory support, like having to put down their throat, to help them breathe, are requiring high amounts of oxygen. Women who were induced had a lower chance of having high blood pressure problems at the end of their pregnancy, sometimes called preeclampsia, and also they reported less overall pain and they reported a greater sense of control over their labor process and a greater sense of agency. Well, that sounds pretty impressive. We'll come back to the implications in a moment. But one of the